On the vast prairie, night lay heavy over the dry wash. Wind cut through the cottonwoods. A single cabin stood small and alone against the dark. Inside, a woman too tall for any doorframe sat by the window. Her shoulders filled the frame. Her hands rested heavy on her knees. No lamp burned. No voice called her name. A shot split the dark. Sharp. Sudden. She was on her feet before the echo died. Rifle already in hand. No one to wake. No one to stop her. Another shot rang out farther now. Then silence. She stepped onto the porch, saddled her only horse, rode into the black. Each hoofbeat struck the earth like a question no one would answer. Blood glistened on pale rock under starlight. A girl lay crumpled against the stone, shoulder torn open, eyes wide with terror, at the giant shape looming over her from the dark. The woman stopped, lowered the rifle to the ground. The town called her a monster before it ever called her by name. Magnolia Thorne stood 6 feet, 11 inches in bare feet, shoulders like a barn door, hands that could crush a walnut without trying. She'd stopped counting the years since anyone in Willow Bend looked her in the eye without flinching, because that's what people did. They flinched. Then they looked away. Then they whispered. She'd grown used to it. Told herself she had, anyway. Except, some mornings the lie didn't hold. Some mornings she caught her own reflection in the wash basin before dawn, before the light was kind enough to soften anything. And she saw herself the way the town saw her. Too much woman crammed into too little patience. A doorframe she had to duck through in her own house. A shadow that fell twice as long as anyone else's. Whether she wanted it to or not, she'd been the tallest child. In every schoolroom she ever sat in, back before her mother stopped sending her. Back before the other children's questions turned from curious to cruel. By 14, she was taller than the schoolmaster. By 16, taller than every man in 3 counties, save one blacksmith who'd looked her up and down once and never spoken to her again. The schoolmaster, at least, had never made a joke of it. He'd simply stopped calling on her, the way a man avoids looking too long at something he doesn't know how to explain. It was, she'd learned early, the kindest kind of cruelty available to her, the quiet erasure rather than the loud mockery. She'd take erasure over mockery most days. It hurt in a duller way, one that let her keep working through the ache instead of stopping cold in the middle of it. There had been offers over the years. Not the kind a woman wanted. A man from a traveling show came through when she was 22. Silk vest, gold tooth, talked fast and smiled faster. Said he could make her rich. Said folks would pay good money just to stand beside her and feel small for once in their lives. She'd looked at him, a long moment. Then she'd told him to get off her land, before she made him feel something else entirely. He left. Word got around anyway. Somebody always talked, because that was the thing nobody understood about a body like hers. It wasn't just the staring. It was the arithmetic other people did in their heads the second they saw her. But she was worth what she was for. Freak show money, farmhand labor, if a rancher was desperate and cheap enough to overlook the wife-shaped absence in his own house. Never a neighbor, never a friend, never just a woman. She'd buried that particular grief so deep she mostly forgot it was there. Mostly. There had been one proposal once, from a widower 2 towns over, who needed hands strong enough to work a failing farm and didn't much care whose hands they were. He'd never once called her by name, only the Thorne woman, as though her whole identity had narrowed down to a surname and a set of useful shoulders. She'd said no. Told herself it was pride. Some nights she suspected it was something closer to hope, stubborn and foolish, refusing to die even after everything that should have killed it. The Thorne Ranch sat 4 miles outside town, tucked against a dry wash where the cottonwood still clung to green even in August. Small house, smaller barn, 1 horse. No family left to speak of, and none she'd found reason to build for herself since. She'd built a life out of routine instead. Wood split at dawn. Fences mended before the heat set in. The same worn path between house and barn worn smoother every year by the same pair of boots. There was a kind of peace in it most days. The kind that came from needing nobody's permission and owing nobody's explanation. And there was a kind of ache in it too, quieter. The sort she'd stopped naming out loud a long time ago, the sort that showed up mostly in the silence. After the evening chores were done, and there was nobody left to talk to but the horse, she split her own wood, mended her own fences, and answered to nobody, which was, she reminded herself often, exactly the way she preferred it. Town was a mile of dust and judgment. She went in twice a month. No more. Feed, flour, whatever supplies the ranch needed that she couldn't make or mend herself. She kept her eyes forward, and her voice low and her business quick. Because quick meant fewer stares, fewer whispers, fewer children pulled behind their mother's skirts like she might reach down and eat them. She never had. Not once. Didn't matter. There she goes. She heard. Outside the mercantile, a woman's voice. Not even lowered, Lord, she gets bigger every year. My Thomas says she could snap a man's spine like a twig. Wouldn't doubt it, Magnolia kept walking, chin level, eyes forward, because if she stopped, if she turned around, if she let them see it landed, well, that would be admitting it landed, and she'd sworn a long time ago, never again. Not for them, the street itself seemed built for smaller people, she sometimes thought. The boardwalks narrow, the doorways low, the whole town, scaled to a version of humanity that didn't include her. She'd learned over the years to duck before she needed to turn sideways through gaps that might have fit her comfortably if she'd been built like anyone else. Small accommodations made 100 times a day that nobody in Willow Bend ever noticed her making. Inside, the mercantile smelled of coffee beans and kerosene, and the particular dust that settled on everything in a town this dry. Old Man Hobbs ran the counter. Decent enough. Didn't stare, at least. Just did his business and let her do hers. Flour, and whatever's cheapest in nails if you've got a sack started. Got a sack right here. Hobbs pulled it down. Set it on the counter without ceremony, which Magnolia appreciated more than she ever said out loud. She counted out coins while he wrapped her flour, the small kindness of an ordinary transaction, settling something in her chest that had been coiled tight since she'd stepped through the door. Hobbs was no friend, but he treated her like a customer instead of a spectacle, and after enough years in Willow Bend, Magnolia had learned to be grateful for smaller mercies than that. Behind her, the bell over the door jingled. 2 boys, maybe 12, 13. She recognized them, Prescott's sons, the banker's family, the kind of children who'd never once had to explain themselves to anybody. They saw her, went still the way children do. Then one elbowed the other, and they both dissolved into snickering that they weren't even trying very hard to hide. Bet she eats a whole cow for breakfast. Bet her feet don't even fit in a coffin. Magnolia's jaw tightened. She didn't turn around. Hobbs did, though. That's enough, you two. Get on home, the boys scattered, still laughing, and Magnolia paid for her flour, with hands that weren't quite steady, and told herself it didn't matter. That words from a couple of banker's brats meant nothing. That she'd heard worse from grown men who ought to have known better. She told herself a lot of things on the ride home, most of them lies. The road back to the ranch ran mostly straight, and she let the mare set her own pace while her mind wandered, where it always wandered after a trip to town, toward the particular arithmetic of being looked at, sized up, and found wanting before she'd said a single word to anyone. She'd stopped expecting kindness from Willow Bend a long time ago. What she hadn't stopped expecting, foolishly, was for the sting of it to someday grow smaller. It never did. It only grew familiar, which she supposed was its own kind of mercy, though a thin one. That night she sat on the porch step, with a tin cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, and the stars doing what stars do, indifferent and endless, and she let herself think about her sister. Just for a minute, just long enough to hurt. Delphine had been small, delicate even, the kind of pretty that made men stop talking mid-sentence. And Magnolia, 8 years older, already too tall by 12, already the subject of every cruel joke in 3 counties. Magnolia had loved her sister with a fierceness that scared her sometimes. They'd been close in the particular way that sisters become close, when the rest of the world treats one of you gently and the other one not at all. Delphine had never once flinched at her size, not even as a small girl. Not even when other children whispered behind their hands. She used to climb up on a Magnolia's shoulders to reach, apples from the highest branches, laughing the whole way up, utterly unafraid of the height or the size of the woman carrying her. There had been summers, once, when the two of them ran wild through the scrub behind their folks' old place. Delphine always half a step ahead, always daring Magnolia to catch her, and Magnolia always letting her win. Because some part of her understood even then that her sister needed the world to feel conquerable, in a way it never quite felt to Magnolia herself. Delphine married at 19, died at 22. Childbed fever, the doctor said. Nothing anyone could have done. Magnolia had been 3 counties away when it happened. Working a cattle drive because nobody in Willow Bend would hire a woman built like a bull to do anything but freak show work, and she'd rather starve than be gawked at for money 3 counties away. When her sister needed her most, she never forgave herself for the distance. Not really, just learn to carry it quiet the way you carry any weight long enough. You stop noticing the ache until you do. She remembered the last letter. Delphine's handwriting gone shaky near the end, the words trailing at odd angles across the page. Come home soon, Mags. I want you to meet the baby. There was no baby to meet. Not one that lived past its 2nd day, anyhow. Magnolia had arrived 4 days too late for either of them. And the preacher had already said his words, over 2 graves instead of 1 crib. And Delphine's husband had looked at Magnolia across that fresh dirt with an expression she never forgot, not blame, exactly, something worse. A kind of tired disappointment, like he'd expected her to be there, and simply wasn't surprised when she wasn't. She'd stood at that graveside taller than every man present, and felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Some things didn't heal. They just went quiet, waited for a night like this one. A porch, a cold cup of coffee, to come creeping back up through the floorboards of her chest. She never spoke of Delphine to anyone in Willow Bend. Not because the grief embarrassed her, exactly, but because she couldn't stand the particular way people's faces changed when they learned. She'd once had a sister worth loving that fiercely, as though it surprised them, as though a woman built like she was built couldn't possibly have room left over in her chest for something as delicate as grief. She kept Delphine for herself instead, folded away in the quiet hours, brought out only on nights like this. One, when the stars insisted on being indifferent, and the coffee insisted on going cold, and there was simply nowhere left to put the memory but into the open dark where it belonged. Since Delphine, there had been no one else close enough to lose. That was, Magnolia had come to understand, its own kind of protection, a life built small and careful enough that grief couldn't find a fresh way in. Whether that counted as wisdom or simple cowardice, she'd never quite decided. Some nights, sitting alone with the coffee gone cold, and the ranch silent around her, it felt like both at once. The gunshot came just past midnight, not close, not aimed at her, but sharp enough to cut through sleep like a blade through canvas. And Magnolia was up before she was fully awake, rifle in hand, moving to the window. Nothing, just the dark and the wind through the cottonwoods, and somewhere out past the wash, one more shot, farther off this time. Then silence. She stood there a long moment, because something in her gut said don't, and something else, something older, something that had nothing to do with sense, said go. She went. There was no one to wake, no one to leave a note for, no small hand to grip hers before she rode out. Just Magnolia, the dark, and whatever instinct had pulled her out of bed in the first place. Saddled the mare in the dark, rode toward the sound. The land out past the wash belonged to nobody and everybody. Contested ground. Apache land by treaty and by right, cattlemen's land by greed and by guns, and neither side much cared what the paper said when the moon was down and nobody was watching. She rode slow, rifle across the saddle, ears straining past the sound of her own mare's hooves for anything, voices, more shots, the particular silence that follows violence once it's finished doing its work. Nothing, just wind, just rock. Just the enormous, indifferent dark, stretching out toward mountains she couldn't see, but knew were there. Out here, the land didn't care one way or another whether a person survived the night. It simply continued, indifferent as it had always been, long before Magnolia, and long after her too, and there was something almost comforting in that indifference. Some nights. Tonight it just felt like one more thing pressing in against her from every direction at once. She almost turned back twice, because a smart woman would have. A smart woman would have decided that gunfire on contested land past midnight was somebody else's business entirely, and ridden straight home and locked the door behind her. She wasn't smart. Not about this. Never had been. She found the blood before she found the girl, a dark trail across pale rock, glistening faint under starlight. Magnolia followed it on foot, leading the mare, rifle low but ready, because whatever had made it that blood might still be close. Nothing was close. Except the girl. She lay crumpled against a boulder, at the base of a narrow ravine. Apache, younger than Magnolia had first thought. Maybe 20, maybe less. Buckskin torn at the shoulder where a bullet had gone through and out again. Blood soaking dark down her side. Breath coming shallow and fast. Magnolia knelt. The girl's eyes opened. Black. Wide. Terrified. Because of course she was terrified. Alone, bleeding, and now a giant loomed over her out of the dark. "I'm not going to hurt you," Magnolia said. Quiet, slow, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. The girl said something back. Apache, fast fright and fall, half swallowed by pain. Magnolia didn't understand the words. She understood the fear. She'd worn that same look on other people's faces her whole life. Just never expected to see it, aimed the other direction. Never expected to be the one someone else feared for a reason that actually made sense. A stranger, armed, standing over her in the dark. "Easy," Magnolia said. "Easy now." She set the rifle down, on the ground. In the dirt, in plain sight, out of reach, the girl watched her do it. Something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, trust. Or something close enough to pass for it, out here in the dark, with no other choice. Her name was Helona. Magnolia got that much before the girl slipped under again, fever climbing, words slurring into half-sentences that trailed off into nothing. The wound in her shoulder was bad. Bullets still in there, near as Magnolia could tell by feel, and infection already starting its slow poison. She needed more than a ranch woman's rough doctoring could give. She needed her people. Magnolia didn't know exactly where Apache began. Knew it was east, past the 3 red stones the old teamers talked about, like a border only fools crossed. Knew it was farther than she could carry a full-grown woman on foot, not fast enough, not with that fever climbing. So there was only one thing to do. It was the thing she did, which she lifted Helona. Careful, so careful. Like the girl weighed nothing, because to Magnolia, nearly nothing she didn't. And set her up onto the mare. Wrapped the reins loose in Helona's good hand, in case she woke enough to need them. Then Magnolia looked at the horse, her only horse. The one that pulled the plow, hauled the feed, carried her 4 miles to town and 4 miles back. The one thing between her and a life with no transportation at all. Out here, alone. She thought about that for exactly as long as it took to think it. There was no long deliberation in it. No weighing of costs against benefits the way a careful woman might have done. Just a girl bleeding out on cold rock, and a fever with no patience left to spare, and a horse that could carry her faster than 2 tired legs ever would. Whatever it cost tomorrow, whatever hardship it bought her in the weeks ahead, none of it weighed anything at all against the plain, uncomplicated fact of a life that could still be saved if she moved fast enough. Then she slapped the mare's flank. "Go on," she said. "Take her home." She walked behind them at first. Then the mare found her own pace, steady and sure-footed even in the dark. Some animal instinct pulling her toward water, toward people, toward whatever pull an injured rider's blood might leave on wind and ground that Magnolia couldn't read, but the horse somehow could. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, Magnolia was alone, on foot, miles from home. No horse. No weapon but the knife on her belt, because she'd left the rifle in Helona's lap, in case of what? She didn't let herself finish the thought. In case the girl needed it more than she did. She kept walking, because what else was there to do? The sun came up mean and fast the way it did out here. No gentle warming. Just a hard white light that turned the whole world into a furnace, within an hour of dawn. Her boots weren't built for this kind of distance. She felt the first blister form somewhere around the 6th mile, the second not long after, and by the 10th mile she'd stopped feeling much of anything below her ankles at all, which she decided was probably worse than the pain would have been. The heat did strange things to a mind left alone with itself for too many hours. She caught herself talking out loud once to nobody, just to hear a voice that wasn't the wind, and stopped herself, embarrassed even with no one around, for miles to witness it. Being alone had never bothered her before. This kind of alone was different, chosen, but also inescapable, with 18 miles of empty land standing between her and anyone who might notice if she simply didn't make it. She thought about the ranch waiting empty for her, and how long it might sit that way if she didn't make it back. No note anyone would read, no one to wonder past a certain point why she hadn't returned. She thought about turning back for water at the wash, decided against it, kept walking, because stopping meant thinking too hard about how far she still had to go. And thinking too hard about that was its own kind of quicksand, so she counted steps instead. 100. Then another 100. Then lost count somewhere past 2,000, and just let her legs carry her, one boot in front of the other, mind gone quiet and strange with heat and thirst, until the whole world narrowed down to nothing but dust and horizon, and the stubborn animal refusal to lie down, 3 red stones. She found them near midday, sun beating hard, her shirt soaked through, her canteen already dry, stacked at the boundary like something ceremonial, worn smooth by generations of hands that weren't hers. Beyond them, she could just make out shapes against the far ridge, structures, smoke rising thin and gray. Halona's people. For a moment she thought she saw movement near the smoke. A rider, maybe. Stopped still, watching the same distance she was watching. She lifted a hand. Not quite a wave. More an acknowledgement. Brought her this far. The rest is yours. If the rider saw it, they gave no sign. Magnolia stopped at the stones. Didn't cross, because crossing wasn't hers to do. She'd done what she came to do. The rest belonged to somebody else's world now. She thought briefly about waiting. About making sure Halona actually reached those distant structures alive, that the fever hadn't won somewhere in the last mile, that the whole desperate gamble of the night before hadn't been for nothing. But waiting meant explaining herself to strangers who owed her nothing and might shoot first and ask questions never. She turned around. Started walking home, 18 miles, give or take. No horse, no water. Nothing waiting for her at the ranch but an empty house and the chores that didn't care whether the person doing them was exhausted half to death. She pushed the thought away. Kept walking, one boot in front of the other. That was the whole plan. That was the only plan there'd ever been. She made it back a little past midnight the next day, feet blistered raw inside her boots, throat like sandpaper, legs shaking with every step up the porch stairs. The house was dark and silent, exactly as she'd left it, and there was something almost unbearable about that particular kind of silence. No one waiting up. No one to ask where the horse had gone. No one to notice at all that she'd nearly killed herself walking 36 miles in under 2 days. She sank down onto the top step instead of going inside, every muscle in her body finally allowed to admit how tired it was, and sat there a long while in the dark. Stars overhead, crickets loud in the empty yard. And Magnolia let herself believe, just for that one night, that the debt was paid, that she'd done a good thing, a right thing, and it would end there, quiet, unremarkable. The way most good things did, she was wrong. Dawn came gray and still. Magnolia woke to a sound she couldn't place. At first. Low, rhythmic. Dozens of them moving together hoofbeats. She was at the window before her mind caught up to her body, rifle already in hand, and what she saw through the glass stopped her heart cold in her chest. They ringed the ranch. Every direction she could see. Horses, riders, still as carved stone against the pale morning sky. She counted without meaning to, the way you count anything that might kill you. 10. 30. Her heart climbed with every number. 40. 50. Because this wasn't a raiding party. Raiding parties didn't ring a house on every side and simply wait. Raiding parties moved fast, hit hard, were gone before you'd finished loading a second round. This was something else. something with patience behind it. And patience aimed at her felt like the most dangerous thing she'd ever seen. 70. Give or take, a pack warriors. Motionless. Watching the house with a patience that felt worse than any charge, any war cry, any sound at all. The horses themselves seemed to understand the stillness required of them, standing without so much as a shifted hoof, as though the entire formation had been carved from the same dawn light that colored the sky behind them. Not one rider spoke, not one so much as glanced toward his neighbor for reassurance. Whatever discipline held 70 men motionless in a stranger's front yard at first light. Magnolia understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, that it was discipline built on something far older and far more serious than mere threat. There was no one else in the house to wake, no one to reassure, no small hand to grip hers in the dark. Just Magnolia, alone, facing whatever this was entirely on her own terms. Outside, one rider raised a hand. The others responded. Instantly. Some shift in formation, discipline, understand, disciplined, deliberate, nothing wasted in the movement. And that was when she saw it. Each rider held something aloft. Small, pale, catching the thin morning light. Feathers, white feathers, every single one. Magnolia had lived on the edge of Apache land her whole life. Had heard the stories, the warnings, the half-truths, passed around by men who'd never once spoken to an Apache in their lives but claimed to know exactly how they'd kill you. She'd never heard of white feathers, didn't know if that was good, didn't know if that was so much worse than bad that there wasn't even a word for it yet. She stood there a long moment, rifle still in hand, weighing her options the way she'd weighed them 100 times over the years, whenever the world decided to test her. Running had never once solved anything for her before. Why would it start now? She set the rifle down on the table, in plain view out of her hands, because whatever this was, she had a feeling a raised weapon would end it faster and worse than an empty one, and walked to the door. Her hand hovered on the latch, because on the other side of that door was every story she'd ever heard about what happened to lone settlers who crossed Apache land. And none of those stories had a happy ending, except she hadn't crossed with a gun. She'd crossed with a dying girl on her only horse. And feathers weren't arrows. She stood there one more second, hand still on the latch, feeling the whole weight of her strange, oversized life gathered up behind that single closed door. Every slight, every whispered joke, every year of being too big for the world to comfortably hold. All of it somehow arriving at this exact moment, on this exact morning, waiting to be answered by whatever waited on the other side. She opened the door. The morning air hit her like cold water. 70 sets of dark eyes tracked her the moment she stepped onto the porch, and for one long, suspended breath, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Just the wind, and the horses' shifting weight, and the low creak of the porch boards under 600 pounds of woman, who suddenly felt, for the first time in years, genuinely small. She'd spent her whole life being the biggest thing in any room, any yard, any street. Not today. Today she was one woman against 70 horses and 70 riders, and whatever unspoken law had brought them here. And every instinct in her body screamed at her to go back inside, bar the door, load every gun in the house and pray it was enough. She didn't move, because running never once solved anything for her before. Why would it start now? Then a rider broke from the formation, middle-aged, streaks of gray through black hair. He walked his horse forward slow, deliberate, the white feather held upright in one hand like something sacred. He stopped 10 feet from the porch, studied her a long moment. Something in his face that wasn't hate, wasn't quite anything Magnolia had a name for. He spoke, Apache, a single word repeated twice, and on the second time he pressed his free hand flat against his own chest. Magnolia shook her head. I don't understand you. The rider reached into a bag at his hip and drew something out that made Magnolia's stomach drop clean through the porch floor. The bridle. Her mare's bridle. The one she'd left on Daisy's head when she sent the horse off. Into the dark with a wounded girl, except it wasn't the same anymore. Someone had painted it. Small symbols in red and white. Careful, deliberate. Nothing accidental about the design. The rider held it up. Looked at her. looked at the symbols, looked at her again, waiting. For what? Magnolia had no idea. I don't know what you want, she said, and heard her own voice crack on the last word. Because 6'11" or not, unbreakable or not, she was one woman on a porch facing 70 strangers, and she had no idea if the next thing that happened was going to be an honor or an execution. The writer studied her face a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was the smile of a man who knew something enormous was about to happen, and found a strange, quiet satisfaction in watching it arrive. Tobar, he said. Tapped his own chest once more, patient now, like a teacher, repeating a lesson for a slow but promising student. Magnolia, she managed. Copied the gesture, awkward, uncertain. My name. Magnolia. Something shifted in Tobar's expression. Approval, maybe. Or simple relief that at least this much could be understood, but between them, he turned, raised his voice. Called something back toward the ridge behind the ranch, toward a canyon Magnolia hadn't even known was there. Hidden in a fold of land she'd ridden past 100 times without ever seeing. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the wind and 70 horses shifting their weight, and Magnolia's own pulse hammering loud enough she was half certain the whole valley could hear it. Then, from that hidden canyon, singing began. It wasn't a war cry. Magnolia had heard war cries before, secondhand, in stories told by men trying to scare each other around a fire. This was nothing like that. It rose in layers. Women's voices first, high and clear, weaving into something that felt less like a threat and more like a hymn. Underneath it, lower voices, men, steady as a heartbeat. Grief and gratitude both, tangled together in the same melody. And Magnolia stood frozen on her own porch, listening to a sound she had no framework for. No story that had prepared her, nothing in her whole life that told her what it meant when Apache voices sang like that at the edge of a stranger's home. Then the procession came around the canyon wall, woman, children, an old man at the front, feathered headdress catching the early light, walking with the kind of authority that didn't need 70 warriors to back it up, though he had them anyway, and beside him, limping. Favoring one shoulder, wrapped tight in fresh cloth, Halona. Alive, Magnolia's knees nearly went out from under her, right there on the porch, from the sheer unclenching relief of it. Because some small buried part of her had been carrying the fear since the moment she slapped that mare's flank in the dark. The fear that she'd sent a dying woman off alone towards strangers, that her one good act had ended in nothing but another death, another failure. Another person she couldn't save. Halona was alive. And walking toward her. For one strange, unguarded second, their eyes met across the yard, and Halona's mouth curved. Small, tired, but real. Not the look of a stranger. The look of someone who remembered exactly whose arms had carried her through the dark 2 nights running. Magnolia felt something in her chest come loose that she hadn't known was tied so tight. The old man reached the base of the porch steps first, stopped, studied Magnolia's face with eyes that had clearly spent decades reading things other men missed. He spoke. Apache, slow, ceremonial. Halona stepped up beside him, translating, her English careful and precise. Despite the pain still etched around her eyes, my grandfather wishes to thank the woman who gave his granddaughter back her life. Magnolia's throat went tight. I only helped someone who was hurt. Anyone would have done the same, Halona translated. The old man's response came sharp, immediate, and something in his tone made it clear he was correcting her, not agreeing. Halona's voice, when she spoke again, had lost its careful neutrality. He says your words are not true. Most would not have helped. Most white settlers who found an Apache woman, bleeding in the dark, would have left her there. Or worse, she paused. But you carried me miles on foot. You gave away your only horse. You did not ask what I could give you in return. The old man stepped closer, placed one weathered hand on Magnolia's forearm, had to reach up to do it, which Magnolia noted with a strange, sad clarity, because nobody reached up to touch her. Not usually, not with kindness. He spoke again. Longer this time. And when Halona translated, her voice had dropped, almost to a whisper, like the words themselves carried weight enough to need careful handling. He says you have honored the sacred law of the horse gift. When a warrior gives their means of survival to save a life, they bind themselves to that life. And to the people of that life, Magnolia felt something cold slide down her spine. Bind. Exactly. Helona hesitated, looked back at her grandfather, who watched Magnolia's face with an expression that gave nothing away. You did not know this law, Helona said finally. But ignorance does not undo a bond already made. You are now connected to my people, in a way that must be honored. Magnolia's mind raced back over the last 2 days, searching for the moment she might have done something differently, might have avoided whatever weight now settled. On to her shoulders alongside every other weight she already carried, she found nothing. There had been no other choice at any point, along that dark ravine. No version of that night, where she left a bleeding stranger to the mercy of infection and exposure. If this was the price of that single decision, she supposed she would simply have to learn to carry it, the same way she'd learned to carry everything else. Behind them, all 70 warriors raised their white feathers, high overhead in one single motion, and the gesture landed on Magnolia's chest like something between a blessing and a verdict, because she couldn't yet tell which one it actually was. Honored how, she said. The old man's eyes stayed fixed on hers. He spoke one final word, sharp. Final. A word that needed no translation for Magnolia to understand it, carried the weight of something enormous, something that would not be undone by wishing it away. Helona's translation came anyway, quiet, almost apologetic. The bond requires a choice. The sacred law demands that the giver of the horse now prove whether their heart truly matches their actions. And if it doesn't, Magnolia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Helona's face went carefully still, then the gift was a lie. And lies about sacred things must be answered, the old man. Gray Owl, Helona called him. When Magnolia finally found the nerve to ask his name, did not linger long on the porch. He spoke a handful more words, brief and final, and turned to walk back toward the gathered warriors, leaving Magnolia standing there with her heart hammering and her hands, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually shaking. Helona stayed a moment longer. I'm sorry, she said, low enough that only Magnolia could hear it. I did not ask for this to fall on you. I only wanted to live long enough to see my grandfather's face again. You don't owe me an apology. Magnolia glanced past her, toward the 70 riders still holding their feathers aloft, like a forest of pale, silent judgment. What happens now? Helona's jaw tightened. Now we prepare. The ceremony of choosing begins at sundown. Until then, you are our guest. And after sundown? Helona met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd woken bleeding in the dark 2 nights before, something like fear flickered across her face on Magnolia's behalf. After sundown, you are our sister, or our enemy. She paused. There is no third road. She left it there, walked back toward the gathering, and Magnolia stood alone on the porch, a long moment before she finally sat down on the top step, the weight of it settling over her slow and complete. Sister or enemy? Nothing in between. She thought briefly about the widower. 2 towns over, about the offers she'd turned down over the years, about every version of a life where somebody else's fate might have been tangled up with her own tonight, waiting behind that door with her, sharing the weight instead of leaving her to carry it entirely alone. There was no one, there never had been, not for a long time now, and she'd made her peace with that 100 times over. Tonight, sitting alone on her own porch steps, with 70 strangers assembling their strange machinery of judgment in her front yard, she found herself making peace with it one more time, because there was nothing else to do but the doing of it. Because good hearts don't always get believed, she thought. Sometimes the world looks at the outside of a person and decides it already knows the inside. She'd lived that her whole life. Tonight she'd simply find out if it happened one more time. The warriors did not leave. They spread instead, slow and deliberate, ringing the ranch at a wider distance, dismounting in shifts, some beginning the work of building what Magnolia would later understand was the frame of a ceremonial circle. Stones laid in a wide ring, not 50 yards from her own front door, on her own land, without asking permission, though somehow it never occurred to her to object. Because this wasn't an invasion. It was a summons. And she was the one being summoned, in her own front yard, under a sky that seemed, to Magnolia's fraying nerves, to be watching right along with everyone else. She spent the first hour simply standing at the edge of her own porch, watching 70 strangers rearrange her land into something she didn't recognize. Children she'd never seen before ran errands between the working adults, carrying water, carrying stone, carrying bundles of dried sage that filled the morning air with a scent she associated, from this day forward, permanently with fear. An old woman knelt at the circle's eastern edge, arranging small clay bowls with a precision that suggested each placement carried meaning. Magnolia had no way of reading. Everything here done according to a logic, centuries older than her own understanding, and she found herself, despite the danger, oddly humbled by the sheer scale of tradition unfolding across her dooryard. There was no one to reassure through the long waiting hours, no small shoulders to steady beneath her hands. She stood at the porch rail alone, watching a life she barely recognized assemble itself around her, and told herself the way she told herself most things these days. That alone was simply the shape her life had always taken, and there was no particular reason tonight should be any different. She found Helona near the growing stone circle, directing two younger women in the placement of the last rocks with quiet, precise instructions, favoring her wounded shoulder, but moving with more strength than Magnolia would have believed possible, only 2 days removed from near death. "Why here?" Magnolia asked. "Why not take me back to your village?" Helona straightened, considering the question. "Because the law says the ceremony must happen where the gift was given. You gave your horse on this land," she gestured, taking in the ranch, the wash, the cottonwoods. "So this land becomes sacred ground until sundown. And what exactly happens is at this ceremony?" Helona's eyes flicked briefly toward the old trader's route her people used, toward the 70 warriors moving with purposeful calm across Magnolia's fields, and something in her expression tightened before she answered. "3 tests," she said. "First, to prove your gift came from a true heart. Second, to prove you understand what sacrifice means by making one yourself. Third," she stopped. "Third, what?" Helona's throat moved as she swallowed. "Third, to prove you would place my people's well-being above your own survival." Magnolia felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her, and though she hadn't moved an inch, "And if I fail any one of those, then the gift was false. And you will be marked as one who steals honor with false generosity." Helona's voice dropped. "Your horse would be returned. You would be free to go, but you would be an enemy to my people forever. No Apache would help you again, no matter how desperate your need. That's not the part that worries me," Magnolia said quietly. "What worries me is what happens to me if I don't fail." Helona looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in her dark eyes. "That," she said, "worries me too." Noon came and went. The warriors worked without pause, the stone circle growing wider, more deliberate. And somewhere in the process an older woman arrived from among the gathered families, not one of the warriors. Not Gray Owl, but a woman with silver-streaked hair and a face carved deep with years, who watched Magnolia across the yard with an expression that was not curiosity. It was something closer to contempt. Magnolia noticed, couldn't not notice, given how long she'd spent her whole life reading exactly that look on other faces. There was something, in the particular way this woman held herself, though, that distinguished her from the townsfolk of Willow Bend. No whispering, no elbowing a neighbor to share the joke. Just a single unwavering stare, direct enough that Magnolia understood, without needing to be told, that whatever judgment this woman carried, she intended to deliver it to Magnolia's face, rather than behind her back. She mentioned it to Helona, later, as the girl helped wrap a fresh bandage around her own shoulder in the shade of the barn. "Who is that?" "The woman with the gray hair. She looks at me like I've already done something wrong." Helona's hand stilled a moment over the bandage. "That is Nasha," she said finally. "She sits among the council of elders who will judge you tonight. She doesn't want me here, no." Helona met her eyes, and there was something careful in the way she chose her next words, like she was deciding how much truth to hand over all at once. She lost her husband many years ago, to a settler, a very large man, larger than most. He beat him to death outside a trading post over a debt of $6, and no law in this territory ever answered for it. The words landed in Magnolia's chest like a stone dropped into still water. And now she looks at me, Magnolia said slowly, and sees him. She sees your size before she sees your face, Helona said. I am sorry, it is not fair to you, but her grief is not a lie either. Magnolia looked across the yard, to where Snasha stood at the edge of the growing circle, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ranch house, like she was already certain of what verdict the evening would bring. And for the first time since the riders had appeared at dawn, Magnolia felt something colder than fear. She felt recognized, in the worst possible way, judged not for anything she'd done, but for the simple, unchangeable fact of her own body, the same thing that had followed her through every town, every stare, every whispered joke her whole life long. Except this time, the judgment carried the weight of 70 warriors and a ceremony that could end with her life on the line. She's not wrong to be afraid, Magnolia said quietly. Somebody like me hurt somebody she loved. That's true. Whether it was me or not, Helona studied her a long moment. Most people, she said, when they are accused of another's crime, only feel anger. You feel something else. What's that? I am not certain yet, Helona admitted. But I think I would like to find out. Nasha crossed the yard herself an hour before the light began to fade. Didn't wait for an invitation. Didn't need one. She stopped an arm's length from Magnolia, looked up, had to look up, which Magnolia could tell cost her something, and spoke in clipped, careful English. You think kindness erases size. I don't think anything erases anything. My husband was kind too, once. Before a man built like you decided $6 was worth his life. I'm not him. You wear his shape. Magnolia's hands curled at her sides, held there. Because striking back even with words would only prove every fear Nasha carried. I can't undo what he did, Magnolia said. I can only tell you I've never once raised a hand against somebody who didn't raise one first. Words. Nasha's eyes didn't waver. Cheap. Then watch me tonight. Judge the doing. Not the shape. Something flickered behind Nasha's eyes. Not softening. Not yet. But something. She turned without another word. Walked back toward the circle, spine straight, and Magnolia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Helona appeared at her elbow. That went better than I expected. That was better? She did not spit at your feet, Helona almost smiled. For Nasha. That is practically an embrace. By late afternoon the circle was finished. Stones laid in a wide, deliberate ring, and at its center, a bare patch of packed earth, where Magnolia understood without being told. She would sit come, sundown, bound and answerable to 5 judges she had never met, defending a kindness she'd never once expected to need defending. Tobar found her near the well, drawing water she didn't particularly need, just to have something to do with her shaking hands. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, watching the bucket rise and fall. You are frightened, he said finally, his English slow but clear, clearly practiced through some other life, some other crossing of worlds she knew nothing about. Wouldn't you be? I was. Once, he nodded toward the circle. My own choosing, many years past, different reason, same fire. Magnolia looked at him properly for the first time since dawn, really looked, saw. Beneath the paint and the feathers, and the 70-strong authority he carried, like a second skin, a man who understood exactly what she was about to walk into. Did you pass? She asked. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. I am here, he said, wearing these feathers. You may judge the answer for yourself. That's not really an answer. No, he agreed. It is not. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. The elders will try to find the worst in you tonight, he said. It is their duty. Do not fight them for it. Let them look. What you gave that horse for, that will hold. If it is true, truth does not need defending, only patience. He walked away before she could think of anything to say back. Magnolia stood a long time at the well, water forgotten, turning his words over like stones in her palm. Truth does not need defending, only patience. She hoped to God he was right. It was a strange comfort, coming from a man wearing the very feathers of an authority that might, before the night was through, decide her fate. But comfort was comfort, however strange its source, and she found herself grateful for it in a way that surprised her, standing there at the edge of her own well as the afternoon light slid slowly toward evening, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath alongside her. Gray Owl summoned her, as the shadows began to stretch long and gold across the yard. He sat cross-legged near the center of the circle, a woven mat spread before him, several objects arranged with obvious care. Halona knelt beside him to translate. Nasha and 3 other elders took their places at intervals around the stones, each face unreadable in the fading light. Gray Owl gestured for Magnolia to sit. She lowered herself down, slow, careful, aware of how her size seemed to swallow the space, even sitting cross-legged on the ground, and waited. Gray Owl spoke. Halona translated, her voice steady despite the tremor Magnolia could see in her hands. He says the ceremony of choosing has 3 parts, and it begins now, whether you feel ready or not. Magnolia looked at the objects laid before the old man. A knife, handle carved with symbols she couldn't read, a small clay pot of what looked like paint, and, resting apart from the others, her own mare's bridle, painted now with the same careful symbols, a physical record of the debt already incurred. First, Halona continued, you must prove your gift came from true care, not from hope of reward, not from guilt, not from the wish for glory among my people. Magnolia's mouth had gone dry. And how do I prove something like that? Gray Owl's eyes, when Halona translated the question, held something that might almost have been sympathy. You do not prove it, Halonsa said once her grandfather answered. You survive it. The elders will ask you questions, questions meant to find any hidden motive, any lie you tell yourself about your own goodness. You will answer bound, unable to defend yourself with anything but your own words. The sun had begun its long slide toward the horizon, throwing the shadow of the ranch house long and dark across the circle of stones, across the 70 silent warriors ringing the property. Nasha's eyes found Magnolia's across the circle, held them. There was no forgiveness in that look, not yet. Gray Owl lifted the small clay pot of paint, dipped one finger, drew a symbol on his own forehead, slow and deliberate, then extended the pot toward Magnolia. The message needed no translation. The ceremony had already begun, ready or not. Somewhere behind her, the last color drained out of the sky, and the first of the torches came to life along the stone circle, and 70 warriors settled into their places to watch a giant woman answer for the size of her own heart. The paint was cold on her forehead, colder than she expected. Magnolia sat cross-legged in the center of the stone circle, wrists bound behind her back with cord that didn't give, not even when she tested it, quiet, in the dark beneath the rising torchlight. 5 elders sat before her in a half-moon, Gray Owl at the center, Nasha to his left, arms folded, jaw set like carved rock. The other 3 she didn't know yet, wouldn't, not until their voices found her in the dark. Because that was how this worked, she understood now. Questions first. Faces second if she was lucky enough to still be sitting here when the questions ran out. The torches threw long shadows across packed earth. Smoke curled up thin against a sky gone fully dark now. Stars scattered thick overhead, indifferent as always to whatever was about to happen down here on the ground. Somewhere behind her she could feel more than see the crowd gathered at the edges of the circle. Warriors, women, children who should have been asleep hours ago, but stood instead in solemn rows, watching a ceremony most of them had only ever heard about, in stories passed down from grandparents who'd witnessed it themselves, once a lifetime ago. Because Halona had been right. This didn't happen often. Maybe once in a generation, if it happened at all. And tonight, Magnolia understood with sudden, dizzying clarity. She was the generation it happened to. One of the unfamiliar elders. A woman old enough that her hair had gone fully white, studied Magnolia with an expression that carried none of Nasha's open hostility, and none of Gray Owl's careful neutrality either. Something closer to simple curiosity, the look of a person examining a puzzle she had not yet decided how to solve. Magnolia found that gaze oddly more unsettling than Nasha's contempt. Contempt she understood. Open curiosity. From a stranger who held some measure of power over whether she lived through the week, she did not. Halona knelt beside her grandfather, translator, witness, the only friendly face in a circle of 70 strangers. She kept her eyes forward, on Grey Owl, on the fire building behind him, throwing long orange shadows across a face that gave nothing away. He spoke. Halona translated. "The first trial begins. Why were you on our land?" The question came from the elder on the far left. Old man, older than Grey Owl even. Voice like gravel dragged across stone. "I wasn't. Not really. I heard shots. Followed the sound. Onto our land. I didn't know exactly where the line sat. Didn't much care either. Somebody was hurt." Nasha's eyes narrowed. "Convenient story. It's the true one. True stories don't need repeating twice. I've only said it once." Silence a beat. Then from Nasha, "You'll say it many times tonight. Watch how it changes." Magnolia's jaw tightened. Because that wasn't a question. That was a promise. A warning. And she understood, sitting there bound in the dirt, that Nasha intended to make good on it. The old man on the far left spoke again, tapping one weathered finger against his knee as he considered his next question. "You say you did not know our girl, had never seen her before that night. Never. Then why not simply ride past? A stranger's trouble, in the dark on land that was not your own." Magnolia was quiet a moment, turning the question over the way she'd turned it over in her own head 100 times since that night. "Because I know what it looks like," she said finally. "To be the one everybody decides isn't worth stopping for. I wasn't going to be the reason somebody else learned that lesson, too. Where's your family?" Different elder. Woman, younger than the rest, sharp-eyed. "Gone. All of them. Parents died of fever when I was young. Sister died in childbirth. No husband, no children. No one who depends on you." Magnolia's throat tightened. "No one," she admitted. "Just me, and whatever land I can hold on to. You are alone then." "Entirely. Entirely." The elder's gaze lingered a moment, and something in her expression shifted, though Magnolia couldn't read it well enough in the firelight to know if it helped her case or hurt it. "A woman alone gives away her only horse," the elder said slowly, "with nothing waiting for her at home to make that loss any easier to bear. That's about the size of it. Why then? Some men give when they have plenty to spare. You had nothing to spare at all." "Maybe that's exactly why," Magnolia said. "I know what it costs to have nobody notice if you don't come home. I wasn't going to let that be true for her, too. That landed harder than she meant it to." She heard it in her own voice, the crack underneath the words, and she hated that 70 strangers and 5 judges got to witness it. But it was true. And she held on to that, said nothing more. Let the silence answer for her. "You gave your horse to a stranger," Grey owled himself this time, his English rough but functional, apparently saved for the moments that mattered most. Why, she was dying. Many things are dying, in this territory. You do not give your horse to all of them. She was in front of me, bleeding. I couldn't just. Magnolia stopped, started again. I've spent my whole life being the one people cross the street to avoid. The one nobody trusts to be gentle, just because of how big I am. I wasn't going to become the thing they already think I am, not when it mattered, so you gave the horse to prove something. About yourself. The words landed like a trap closing. "No," Magnolia said, too fast, then made herself slow down. "No, I didn't think about proving anything. I thought about a woman bleeding out on rock, and a fever climbing, and 18 miles between her and help. There wasn't room in my head for anything else. Not pride, not fear. Just get her there." Grey Owl studied her a long moment. "That," he said, "sounds truer than your first answer." Nasha leaned forward. "Or it sounds like a woman clever enough to know which lie plays best." "I'm not clever," Magnolia said. "Never claimed to be. I'm just tired of being sized up before I've said a single word." "Then perhaps," Nasha said, voice like flint, "you understand a little of what it is to be my people. Side up." Before we've said a single word, the circle went quiet, because that landed. On both of them, equally, and Magnolia felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it, even as her wrists ached against the cord and the fire popped and spat behind Grey Owl's silhouette. "I do understand that," Magnolia said, quiet now. "More than you know." Nasha didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The questions kept coming, wave after wave, some gentle, some sharp enough to cut. The sharp-eyed elder leaned forward again. Has anyone ever offered you money for your size? Magnolia's stomach turned cold. Yes, and you refused. Yes, why? Money feeds a person through hard winters. Because it would have meant standing in front of strangers who paid to gawk at me like livestock. I'd rather go hungry, pride, Nasha said. Not virtue. Maybe both, Magnolia admitted. I've never pretended to be simple, ma'am. Just honest. The old man on the far left spoke again, voice softer now. You say you were not seeking reward when you helped our Halona, yet here you sit, being offered the greatest reward my people can give. A place among us, a family larger than any you have known. Does some part of you welcome that? Magnolia was quiet a long moment, because the honest answer cost her something to say out loud. Yes, she said finally, some part of me does. I won't lie and say I haven't spent tonight imagining what it might feel like to belong somewhere, anywhere. But I didn't carry Halona 18 miles hoping for that. I carried her because leaving her there would have made me exactly the kind of monster this whole territory already thinks I am. The wanting came after. Not before. You separate the two easily, Nasha said. No, Magnolia said. Not easily. But I separate them honestly. That's the best I've got to offer you tonight. Gray Owl watched her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Did she expect payment? No. Did she expect gratitude? No, hoped for it maybe. Didn't expect it. Did she believe herself a good woman? Silence first. Long enough that the fire cracked twice before she answered. I don't know, she said finally. I know I couldn't leave her there. Whether that makes me good, I've stopped trying to answer that question about myself a long time ago. Other people already answer it for me. Every day whether I ask them to or not. And what do they answer? The sharp-eyed elder asked. Monster usually. Nobody spoke for a moment. And do you believe them? Gray Owl asked. Quiet now. Almost gentle. Magnolia looked up, past the fire, past the 5 faces judging her. Into the dark beyond the torchlight, where nobody at all stood waiting for her to come home safe. Some days, she said. Some days I still do. But I've never once done a cruel thing to anybody who didn't put a weapon in my hand first. If I was really the thing they all say I am, I think that would have shown itself by now. With nobody left around to keep me honest but myself, the gray-haired elder who had spoken least all night finally leaned forward, studying Magnolia with an intensity that made her want to look away, and didn't let her. One more question, he said, voice quiet but carrying. If no living soul had witnessed what you did that night, if no one would ever have known, would you have given the horse anyway? The question landed somewhere Magnolia hadn't expected, past all her careful honesty, into a place she hadn't examined even for herself. Yes, she said, and heard the certainty in her own voice before she'd fully decided to feel it. Nobody was watching, out there in the dark. Nobody's ever watching, most nights of my life. That's exactly why I know the answer's true. Silence again. Different this time. Heavier. Gray Owl exchanged a glance with the elder beside him. Something passed between them that Magnolia couldn't read, and for one terrible suspended moment, she thought she'd said something wrong. Something that would end this before it had a chance to end fairly. Then Gray Owl spoke. Longer than before. Halona's translation came slow. The first trial has ended. The elders believe your heart was true when you gave the gift. Relief cracked through Magnolia's chest so fast it nearly knocked the breath out of her. Then Nasha raised a hand, spoke sharp, fast, and the relief drained right back out again. Halona's face went pale. Wait, Magnolia said. What did she say? Halona hesitated. Looked at her grandfather who gave the smallest nod. Permission to speak the truth, even when the truth was heavy. Nasha does not accept the verdict, Halona said. She wishes to stop the ceremony here. She says no further trial is needed. That a woman of your size should never be trusted, no matter what she says with her mouth, and that the council risks the safety of our people by continuing. The circle erupted in low, overlapping voices, elders and warriors alike murmuring, and Magnolia felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the packed earth she sat on. She's trying to end this, Magnolia said. Right now. Before it even gets to the second trial. Yes, Halona said quietly. Can she do that? Halona didn't answer right away. Watched the argument building between her grandfather and Nasha, voices rising, other elders leaning in, the whole fragile structure of the evening threatening to come apart at the seams. Before Magnolia had even survived the easiest of the three trials, Gray Owl's voice cut through the argument. Sharp. Final. You would end this on your grief alone, he said to Nasha, and though he spoke in Apache, Halona's whispered translation kept pace, urgent, breathless. Your grief is honored in this circle. It has always been honored, but it does not speak for 70 families tonight. Nasha rose to her feet, voice rising with her. And if I am right, if this is another man in a woman's shape, learning our ways only long enough to betray them, then the trials will show it, Gray Owl answered. That is what trials are for, not to spare us from doubt, but to test it. You already favor her. I favor the law, Gray Owl said, and something in his tone made even Nasha go quiet a moment. I favored it the day it took my own brother from me, sent into trial for a debt he did not owe. And I did not stop the ceremony then either. Though I begged the council for exactly what you asked tonight. The law does not bend because our hearts do. The words landed heavy across the circle. Magnolia hadn't known that. Hadn't known Gray Owl carried his own old grief wrapped inside this same ceremony. Hadn't understood until this moment that the law binding her tonight had already cost this old man something dear, once, long before she ever arrived at the edge of his people's land. Nasha's jaw worked, some private battle playing out behind her eyes. Halona translated, though her voice shook slightly on the words. My grandfather says the law does not permit a single elder to end a ceremony once begun. All 5 must agree, or the trial continues. Nasha's eyes found Magnolia's across the fire. No softening there, none at all. 4-1, Halona said. The ceremony continues. Nasha stood. For a moment, Magnolia thought she might simply walk away, take her objection and her grief and leave the circle entirely, and something in Magnolia's chest ached at the thought. Not fear for herself, but something closer to sorrow. Woman still carrying a wound that never had the chance to heal right. But Nasha didn't leave. She sat back down, arms folded, eyes locked on Magnolia like a hawk that had simply decided to wait a little longer before striking. I will watch, she said, in English now, clipped and cold. Every trial, every word. If your heart breaks even once beneath the truth, I will be the first to know it. Then watch close, Magnolia said. I've got nothing left to hide from you. They untied her hands to bring water, to let her stretch cramped muscles before the second trial began. Magnolia used the moment to breathe, to steady herself against whatever came next, though nothing in her life had prepared her for what that turned out to be. Halona appeared at her side, expression carefully composed in a way that told Magnolia the news wasn't going to be easy. The trial of sacrifice, Halona said. It begins now. What does that mean? Exactly, Halona's throat moved. It means you must prove you understand what it costs to give something that matters, truly costs. Not a horse you could someday earn back the price of. Something with no price at all. 2 young men approached, carrying between them a wooden box, worn smooth with age, and handled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for something holy. Gray Owl rose to meet them, opened the box himself. Inside, resting on dark cloth, 5 arrows, each fletched with a different color: red, black, white, yellow, and last wrapped separate from the others as if even the box itself understood. Its arrow carried more weight than the rest. Blue. The crowd had gone entirely silent at the sight of the box, a silence with a different texture than any that had come before it that night. Not the hush of anticipation, but something closer to dread, as though every person gathered understood exactly what those 5 colors represented and wished, for Magnolia's sake as much as their own, that the box had simply never needed to be opened at all. Gray Owl lifted the box, showed it to the circle, spoke at length in a tone that carried the weight of ceremony, older than anyone gathered. Halona's translation came haltingly. 5 of our people have volunteered to face danger, so that your worthiness might be tested, she said. You must choose one, their trial, their risk, their proof of your right to belong. Magnolia stared at the arrows a long moment before the meaning fully landed. You want me to choose someone else to risk their life, she said slowly. For me, yes, that's not sacrifice. That's the opposite of sacrifice. That, Helona said quietly, is exactly what the trial is meant to reveal. Whether you understand the difference, Magnolia's gaze swept the circle. 5 faces stepped forward from among the gathered families, and her stomach dropped clean through the earth at the sight of them. A boy, barely past childhood himself, eyes too eager for what he was volunteering for. 15, maybe. Old enough to think himself invincible. Young enough that Magnolia doubted he understood, not truly, what a mountain lion's claws could do to a body that size. A woman perhaps 40, kind-faced, steady. Magnolia would later learn her name was Tai Sanhui, and that she'd already survived 1 husband lost to fever and buried 2 children before their 5th winters. And that she volunteered for these things now, always, because grief had long since stopped teaching her to fear death the way it taught other people. An older warrior, scars mapping Laya both forearms like a record of every danger he'd already survived. He caught Magnolia's eye and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, whatever you decide, I have made peace with it already. A girl no older than 16, and something in the shape of her face, the particular tilt of her chin, struck Magnolia so hard she had to look away, because, for one disorienting second, that girl looked exactly like Delphine had, at that same age, before the world took her too. Same dark eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw. Magnolia's chest ached with a grief so sudden and complete it nearly buckled her where she sat, and last. A man near Magnolia's own age, wife and 2 small children visible at the edge of the firelight, watching their father volunteer to risk everything, so a stranger might be judged worthy. Magnolia made herself look at each of them in turn, deliberately, refusing the easy comfort of glancing away. 5 separate lives, 5 separate reasons someone might choose to stand in that firelight and offer themselves up. None of them owed her anything. And yet here they stood, waiting with a patience that made her chest ache, worse than any of the physical trials still to come. What are the trials? Magnolia asked. Voice barely steady. Helona pointed to each arrow in turn. Red. Cross the canyon rapids at night. Black. Enter the mountain lion's den and retrieve a stone from its deepest chamber. White. Climb the cliff face no one living has ever conquered. Her voice caught slightly. Yellow. Enter the territory of a rival tribe who killed 3 of our own last spring, alone and return with proof of peaceful contact. She paused. And blue, she said. So quiet Magnolia had to lean in to catch it. Blue means allowing a rattlesnake to strike, and trusting the old medicine to save the life after. Every single option was a near-certain death sentence, and Magnolia was being asked to choose which innocent person would face it, for her, because of her. I won't, she said. The circle went still. I won't choose, she said again, louder now, forcing the words out past the tightness in her throat. I won't send somebody else to die so I can wear a feather. That's not honor. That's cowardice wearing honor's clothes. Gray Owl's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, watching her closely now in a way that felt different from before. There is another path, Helona said slowly. You may refuse to choose, and instead offer to face all 5 trials yourself. Then that's what I'll do. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Disbelief, Magnolia realized, actual disbelief, because apparently nobody expected the offer to even be spoken aloud. You do not understand, Helona said, urgent now. No one has ever survived all 5 trials alone. It has never even been attempted. It would almost certainly mean your death. Tonight. Then it means my death. Magnolia's voice didn't shake, though everything inside her was shaking plenty. Not somebody else's. Not that girl's. She nodded toward the 16-year-old, throat tight. Not that man's, with 2 children watching him volunteer to die for a stranger. Mine. If anyone's spirit gets weighed tonight, let it be the one that actually made the choice. Helona's voice cut through the crowd before the council could respond. No. She stepped forward, out from behind her grandfather's shoulder, breaking whatever careful protocol had kept her silent through the trial so far. If she will not choose from among the 5, then let me stand in her place. I am the one whose life was bought with that horse. If a debt must be paid in blood, let it be mine to offer, not a stranger's. The circle went utterly silent, because the girl whose lived had just offered her own life right back, and something about the raw, unfiltered honesty of it landed on every single person gathered like a physical blow. Gray Owl's face, for the first time all night, showed something close to real alarm. "Granddaughter," he began. But Helona did not back down, chin lifted, wounded shoulder held stiff and proud. "I mean it," she said. "I have already been given back my life once tonight. I would rather spend it standing beside her than watch her spend hers alone." Magnolia felt something crack open in her own chest at the sight of it. This girl, barely into womanhood, offering to walk back into fire for a stranger's sake, exactly the way Magnolia had once walked into the dark for hers. "No," Magnolia said, before the council could even answer. "Absolutely not. You've already bled enough for 1 week. I won't let you bleed more on my account." "Then we are the same," Helona said, something fierce and wet in her eyes. "Because I feel exactly the same about you." Gray Owl watched the exchange between the two of them a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his weathered face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight than it had all night. Helona translated for him, her own voice thick, though the words were about her as much as Magnolia now. "My grandfather says he has not seen such a thing in many years. A stranger and a granddaughter, each offering to carry the other's fire," Gray Owl continued, and Helona's translation slowed. "Careful with it," he asks. "Does this change what her heart truly is? Or does it only prove what he already suspected and nothing more?" Magnolia looked at Helona, who looked steadily back, refusing to be the one to look away first. "It doesn't prove anything about me," Magnolia said, voice rough. "But it tells you plenty about her, and I'll be damned if I let this ceremony be the thing that gets her hurt worse, over a debt that was never hers to pay in the first place." She turned to Helona directly. "Stand down, please. Let me carry what's mine to carry." Helona's jaw worked a long moment, before she finally, reluctantly, stepped back to her grandfather's side. Though her eyes never once left Magnolia's face, one of the elders spoke, low, and Helona's translation came slow, careful, once she'd composed herself enough to give it. "The council must consider what has happened." "Wait." The 5 elders drew close together, voices dropping too low for Magnolia to catch even the shape of the words. Nasha's voice rose above the others once, twice, sharp and insistent, and each time Gray Owl's voice answered, steady, immovable, the weight stretched. Long enough that the fire needed feeding twice. Long enough that Magnolia's knees ached from kneeling, from the tension coiled through every muscle in her enormous frame. Finally, Gray Owl straightened. Helona stepped forward to translate, and there was something different in her posture now. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful hope she seemed almost afraid to fully feel. "The council has decided," she said. "Your offer, to face all 5 trials, alone, will be honored. No innocent life will be placed at risk tonight beyond your own." Relief and terror arrived in the same breath, tangled together so tight Magnolia couldn't tell which one was winning. "There is more," Helona said, and her voice caught. "What?" "The trials will begin at first light." "Not tonight." She glanced toward her grandfather, who nodded once, permission granted. "The council believes a choice made in exhaustion at midnight, bound and frightened, is not the same as a choice made with clear eyes and rested body. If you are to risk your life for this, they wish the choice to be made honestly, not desperately." Magnolia felt something crack open in her chest, not relief exactly, because 5 near-certain deaths still waited for her at dawn, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe, that even here, even now, even facing a woman who called her a monster, before she'd said a single word, there was fairness being offered where none was required. "Why?" she asked. "Why? Give me the night." Gray Owl answered directly this time, his rough English carrying weight enough that Helona didn't need to translate. "Because," he said, "a coward asks for shortcuts. A true heart only asks for honesty. Tonight you asked for neither. You asked to bear another's burden alone, and turned away even a willing hand that offered to share it. That is rare enough to deserve one more sunrise before it is tested." They untied her fully then, wrists raw and aching, and led her back toward the ranch house under careful watch. Not prisoner, exactly, not yet guest either, but something suspended between the two, held in the strange gravity of a night that hadn't finished deciding what she was. The house felt different, walking back into it alone. Smaller, somehow, though nothing about its walls had changed. Just the weight of what waited outside them now, 70 warriors and 5 judges, and a dawn that might be the last one she ever watched rise. Magnolia moved through the small rooms slower than usual, touching things she'd touched every day for years without ever really seeing them. The worn handle of the coffee pot, the quilt her own mother had stitched decades before either of them was born. Ordinary objects, suddenly precious in the particular way that ordinary things become precious. Only once a person understands she might be looking at them for the last time. She sat on the porch steps alone, same as every ordinary night before this one, and let herself think about the cliff waiting for her at dawn, about whether anybody had ever survived a fall from that height, about her sister climbing a bluff a lifetime ago and trusting somebody else to go first so she wouldn't have to be scared alone. Nobody was going first for Magnolia tonight. There was a strange, clean simplicity in that, once she let herself sit with it long enough. No one else's fear to manage alongside her own, no small face to keep brave for. Just her and the dark and whatever waited at first light. We used to climb the bluff behind our folks' old place, she remembered, back when we were girls. Delphine always went first, even though Magnolia was bigger, even though she could have caught her if she fell. Said somebody had to be brave first so the other one didn't have to be scared alone. She'd fallen once, not far. Just far enough to scare them both good. Magnolia had never let her climb first again after that. Should have climbed with her at the end too, she thought. The way she'd thought it 100 times before. The real end. Wasn't there. 3 counties away, working. When Delphine needed somebody to go first for her one last time, she let the tears come quiet in the dark, where nobody but the stars could see them fall. Helona found her there sometime later, hesitant in a way that didn't suit the fierce young woman Magnolia had come to know over these strange 2 days. "May I sit?" Helona asked. "It's your ceremony. I don't imagine you need my permission. Tonight. I would like it anyway." Helona lowered herself onto the step, wincing slightly as her wounded shoulder protested the movement. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way Magnolia hadn't expected. "I meant what I said in the circle," Helona said finally. "About standing in your place, I know you did. That's exactly why I couldn't let you." Helona was quiet a moment, staring out at the dark shape of the mountains beyond the ranch. "When I was younger," she said finally, "before I was old enough to carry a bow, my own mother nearly died crossing that same river you will cross tomorrow, fleeing soldiers in flood season, with me strapped to her back. She made it. Barely. I do not remember it. I was too small. But I have heard the story enough times that I sometimes believe I do. Is that meant to comfort me or terrify me? Neither." A small, tired smile. "It is meant to tell you that the river has taken much from my people and given little back, and yet here I am. Because someone risked everything, once, and the river let her live." She looked at Magnolia directly. "I do not know if it will be so generous tomorrow, but I know it has been before." "That's not nothing," Magnolia said. "No," Helona agreed. "It is not nothing." She rose to leave, then paused at the bottom step, glancing back. "Whatever Nasha believes," she said, "I do not believe you are what you fear yourself to be. I have not believed it since the moment you knelt beside me in the dark, with an empty rifle at your feet and your own hands raised, more afraid of frightening me than of anything I might do to you." She left before Magnolia could find any words to answer with, and Magnolia sat alone on the porch, a long while afterward, turning the girl's words over like a stone worn smooth by a river she hadn't crossed yet. Sleep didn't come easy. Didn't come at all if she was honest with herself, though she lay still on the narrow bed in the empty house, exhausted past the point where fear could keep her conscious any longer. Magnolia stared at the ceiling and thought about white cliffs and rattlesnakes, and a river running fast enough to drown a woman twice her size, if the current caught her wrong. She thought about her sister, 22 years old and gone before her time, and wondered, not for the first time, whether some families were simply built for early graves, whether tomorrow might be the day the pattern finally claimed her too. She thought about Nasha's eyes across the fire, sharp and unforgiving, and wondered if there was any version of tomorrow that could soften a grief that deep. Mostly, though, she thought about Halona. Alive, breathing, walking on her own 2 feet despite a wound that should have killed her. And told herself, over and over, until the words started to feel almost true, that whatever waited at dawn, at least that part had been worth it. Whatever came next. At least that part had been real. She must have drifted, eventually, because the sound of hooves outside pulled her from something like sleep, sometime past the deepest hour of night. She rose careful and found Tobar waiting by the barn, alone. No torch, just moonlight silvering the yard around him. You should be resting, he said. So should you. I do not sleep well before a trial either. Not even when it is someone else's. He'd come alone, she realized, without the customary escort that seemed to follow every other member of the council wherever they went. Whatever brought him out to her barn in the deepest hour of night, it wasn't official business. It was, she suspected, something closer to a kindness he wasn't quite willing to name as such. Magnolia leaned against the fence rail, exhaustion and fear tangled so tight in her chest she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Tell me honestly, she said. Has anyone survived even one of these 5? In all the years this ceremony has existed, Tobar considered the question a long moment before answering. The river, yes. Difficult, but men have crossed it. The lion's den, rarely and never without injury. The cliff, he paused. Twice that I know of in my grandfather's time, and both men fell. One did not, and the rival territory, the rattlesnake, no one has attempted either in my lifetime. They are reserved for the gravest doubts a council can hold. I have never seen a council so divided as to require all 5 arrows drawn from the box in a single night, so I'm the first fool to try 5 in a row. You are the first person willing to try any of it, rather than send another to die in your place. Or accept another's offer to share the burden. Something shifted in Tobar's voice, quieter now. Whatever happens at dawn, that is already worth remembering. Whether you survive it or not, that's a hell of a thing to say to someone the night before they might die. I did not say it to comfort you. Tobar met her eyes steadily. I said it because it is true, and you asked for honesty. Magnolia huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. Truth does not need defending. Only patience. That's what you told me yesterday, and has it held true so far? She thought of Nasha's near veto, of Halona's offer to stand in her place, of Grey Owl's own long-buried grief, surfacing just long enough to hold the ceremony together. So far, she admitted, barely. Then hold to it one more day, Tobar said. That is all courage ever really is. One more day, held on to a little longer than you thought you could manage. He turned to go, then paused, glancing back at her with something almost gentle in his weathered face. For what it is worth, he said. If the choosing were mine alone to make, I would not need 5 trials to know your answer. He walked off into the dark before she could ask him what that meant, leaving her alone at the fence rail, with the moon overhead and 5 impossible mornings' worth of fear settling heavy into her bones. Dawn arrived too soon, and not soon enough, both at once. Magnolia woke before the light fully broke, some old instinct pulling her upright before her mind had caught up to the day waiting outside. Today, she said out loud, to no one, just to hear it settle into the room. They dressed in silence. Outside, the sound of 70 warriors already stirring, horses shifting, low voices carrying on the cool morning air, and beneath all of it, the particular hush that settles over any gathering that knows it's about to witness something it will remember for the rest of its life. Halona was waiting at the porch steps when Magnolia stepped outside. Dressed now in traditional garments, Magnolia didn't recognize, her expression carefully composed though her eyes betrayed the sleepless night she'd clearly spent as well. You look rested, Halona said, though the words carried no real conviction. I look like a woman about to face a mountain lion's den on 4 hours of no sleep at all. That too, Halona admitted, and something almost like a smile flickered across her face before the weight of the day pulled it back down. Gray Owl approached, Nasha a step behind him, and the whole gathered crowd seemed to draw one collective breath, waiting. "The trials begin now," Gray Owl said, his English rough but clear. "You may still choose differently, even now." No shame follows a change of heart. Magnolia looked past him, to the 70 warriors ringing the yard, to Nasha's unforgiving eyes, to the memory of her sister 22 and gone too soon, climbing a bluff she should never have gone up first. "I already chose," Magnolia said. "Last night." Choosing again wouldn't change the answer. Gray Owl studied her a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned to lead her toward the canyon rim where the first trials waited. The walk took the better part of an hour, the whole procession moving in near silence. 70 warriors, 5 elders, the gathered families. The land changed as they walked. Familiar scrub and rock giving way to deeper canyon country, walls rising steep on either side, until finally the roar of water reached them, before the river itself came into view. It was worse than she'd imagined. White water churned between narrow rock walls, fast and violent, carrying broken branches downstream at a speed that made her stomach drop just watching them pass. No gentle crossing here, no shallow ford, just raw current, cold enough to stop a heart, powerful enough to pull a grown ox off its feet if it misjudged a single step. Gray Owl stopped at the canyon rim, 20 feet above the water, where a narrow trail wound down toward the bank. "The trial is simple to explain," he said, "though not simple to survive. You must cross to the far bank and return, using nothing but your own strength. No rope, no aid. If the river takes you, no one may enter the water to pull you free. That would break the trial, and break the law along with it. And if I make it across but can't make it back, then you remain on the far bank, alive. But the trial is failed, and the ceremony ends there." Whatever the reason, Magnolia looked down at the water, feeling its violence even from 20 feet above, a physical pressure against her chest that had nothing to do with distance. The red arrow. The rapids, night crossing meant for darkness. But they were sending her at dawn instead, first light catching the water in a way that showed her exactly how fast, how violent, how utterly indifferent that current would be to a woman twice the size of anyone who'd ever attempted it before. Magnolia stood at the top of the trail a long moment, alone with it the way she'd been alone with most things that mattered in her life. No small arms wrapped around her waist for one last squeeze of courage, no promise to make and keep. Just her own 2 hands, her own 2 feet, and 18 miles of memory pressing in against the morning. She thought of Delphine 22, and gone too soon. Climbing a bluff she should never have gone up first. She thought of Halona's offer the night before, and the particular ache of having to refuse a kindness freely given. She thought of Nasha's eyes, waiting, still to be proven right. She thought of the fence rail, the moon, the way Tobar's voice had refused to comfort her with anything but honesty. Then she started down the trail, toward the water, and let the current decide what kind of woman she really was. The water hit her like a wall. The crowd had gathered along both canyon rims before she'd even reached the trail down to the water. Warriors on horseback lining the high ground, families settling onto rocks and ledges with the particular patience of people who understood they were about to witness something worth remembering. Not cold, colder than cold. The kind of cold that stole breath straight out of a chest before the mind even had time to brace for it. Magnolia's boots found the riverbed, lost it, found it again, and the current dragged at her legs with a strength that made her understand, in one single terrifying instant, exactly how many grown men this river had swallowed whole over the years. She pushed forward, one step, then another. Because stopping meant the current would decide for her, and she'd be damned if anything decided for her today except her own 2 feet. The far bank looked impossibly distant. 20 yards, maybe. Might as well have been 20 miles with the water. Clawing at her waist, rising toward her chest, rocks shifting treacherous beneath boots that couldn't find solid ground for more than a heartbeat at a time. Halfway across, a branch slammed into her hip, hard enough to buckle her knee, hard enough that for one sickening second, She felt her whole enormous body tip sideways, the current seizing the advantage instantly, pulling her downstream with a force that no human strength should have been able to fight. She fought anyway. Because Nasha was watching, waiting for exactly this moment. The moment the giant finally proved too big to fight and too proud to admit it. Magnolia planted one enormous hand against a submerged boulder, felt her palm tear open on unseen edges, and hauled herself upright through sheer stubborn refusal to go under. The far bank came slow, agonizingly slow, but it came. She hauled herself up onto dry rock, chest heaving, blood running from her palm, every muscle in her body screaming in protest, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to simply breathe. Then she turned around, because the trial wasn't crossing. The trial was crossing back. The second crossing nearly took her. Exhaustion had crept into her legs during those 3 seconds of rest, made everything heavier, slower, less certain. Twice the current nearly won. Twice she felt the particular terror of a body, no longer fully under its own control, carried instead by something vast and indifferent and utterly uninterested in whether she lived or drowned. Somewhere near the middle, the current found a weakness she hadn't known. She had up, twisting her sideways, so hard she swallowed a mouthful of icy water before she could stop herself, coughing, gasping, momentarily blind to which direction the bank even lay. She found it again by instinct alone, some animal part of her that refused, even disoriented and half-drowned, to simply stop moving. She made it, barely. Collapsed onto the near bank in front of 70 witnesses, gasping, bleeding, alive. The crowd didn't cheer. Apache ceremony, she was learning fast, didn't work that way. But something moved through the gathered warriors. A low murmur, and when she finally lifted her head, she caught Tobar's eyes across the distance. He nodded. Once. Whatever that nod meant, it felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on all morning. Gray Owl approached, studied her, a long moment, then spoke, and Helona, soaked to the knees herself, from wading out to help Magnolia, those final unsteady steps onto dry land. Breaking no rule, since the trial itself was already finished, translated with a voice thick, with something that might have been relief. The first trial is past. The river did not take you. Barely. Magnolia managed. Voice raw. Barely. Gray Owl agreed. Is still past. They gave her an hour. Helona was careful to explain that the law required rest between trials. A fixed measure of time, meant to test resolve as much as recovery. Because a woman too, exhausted, to continue by choice, had already answered a question the trial itself hadn't finished asking. Magnolia spent the hour with her hand wrapped in clean cloth, Helona sitting close beside her, tending the worst of the scrapes with quiet efficiency. You're bleeding badly, Helona said, frowning at her palm. I'll live. You keep saying that, something tight in her voice. What if one time it isn't true? Magnolia had no answer for that. Not one that wouldn't be a lie. The lion's den is next, she said instead. Because avoiding the question felt worse than facing it. The cave mouth gaped black against the canyon wall, narrow enough that Magnolia had to turn sideways to fit through the entrance at all. An indignity that struck her, absurdly as almost funny, given everything else this morning had already asked of her. Almost funny. Not quite. Gray Owl stood at the entrance, expression unreadable in the harsh midday light. The stone rests in the deepest chamber, he said. English rough but clear now, as though the morning's trials had earned her the dignity of hearing this from him directly. You will carry no torch, no weapon beyond the knife at your belt. The lion may be inside, it may not. That is not for us to control, and if it is inside, then you will learn quickly what kind of woman you are. Comforting. Not remotely. Behind her, the gathered crowd had gone quiet in a different way than they had at the river. No cheering allowed there either. But at least the water had been visible, its danger something everyone could watch unfold together. The cave offered nothing but a black mouth in solid rock, and the promise that whatever happened next would happen unseen, unwitnessed except by whatever waited inside. Magnolia stepped into the dark. The cave swallowed sound the way the river had swallowed light. Total, immediate, disorienting. She moved by feel, one hand trailing the rock wall, the other holding the knife loose and ready. every sense straining against a blackness so complete it felt almost physical, a weight pressing in from every direction at once. Because that's what fear did in the dark, she realized. It stopped being a feeling and started being a place. Somewhere you occupied with your whole body, not just your mind. She heard the growl before she saw anything at all. Low, close, closer than she'd braced for, coming from somewhere just ahead, and slightly to the left, and every muscle in her body locked rigid at the sound. Don't run, she told herself. Don't run, don't run, don't. Except running wasn't even possible in a passage this narrow, this dark, with rock pressing close on every side. There was only forward, only through. She kept moving, slower now, knife raised. The growl came again, and this time she caught the faint gleam of eyes reflecting whatever thin light still reached this deep. Not close enough yet to strike, but close enough that Magnolia understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that the next several seconds would decide everything. She didn't wait for the strike. She didn't lunge for the kill. She lunged sideways, slamming her full weight into the narrow gap between them, using the passage itself as a wall, pinning the animal's charge against stone before it could fully strike. Its claws caught her forearm as it twisted free, 4 hot lines of pain, but the force of her had already broken its charge. It screamed once and fled deeper into the dark, rather than face her again. Magnolia stood there a long moment, knife still raised, heart hammering, blood running warm down her arm, understanding only slowly that she hadn't killed anything at all. She'd simply refused to be moved. She'd done it. She was alive. The stone, when her shaking hands finally found it in the deepest chamber, felt almost anticlimactic. Small, smooth. Nothing about it suggested the price it had nearly cost. She carried it back out into blinding daylight, legs unsteady, and let herself simply stand there a long moment, breathing, before anyone approached. Nasha reached her first, taking Magnolia's torn forearm without asking permission, examining the 4 raw lines that would scar white for the rest of her life, with the brisk efficiency of someone determined not to let sensibility slow her down. She didn't speak until Halona arrived with clean cloth. 2 trials, Nasha finally said. Passed. 2 trials, Magnolia agreed. 3 left. The cliff is next. Something in Nasha's tone made Magnolia look up sharply. You sound like you already know how that one ends. Nasha held her gaze a long moment. I know that no one has climbed it and lived unbroken, she said. I know that you are bleeding and exhausted, and that pride has carried braver warriors than you to their deaths. On that rock face, a pause. I also know that you did not flinch from the river or the dark or the lion's teeth. I do not yet know what that means about you, but I have stopped being certain it means nothing. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even close, but it was the first crack Magnolia had seen in that unforgiving armor since the moment the 70 warriors first appeared at dawn 2 days ago, and she found herself absurdly, desperately grateful for even that much. Thank you, Magnolia said quietly. Nasha didn't answer, just turned and walked away, though something in her posture had loosened just slightly on the way. The cliff waited at the far edge of the canyon, and the sight of it up close stole whatever remained of Magnolia's breath before the climb had even begun. Sheer rock, rising nearly 200 feet, sun-bleached and merciless, without a single obvious handhold visible from the base. The wind up here carried a different quality than it had down in the canyon, sharper, colder, carrying the particular hush that settled over any place that had claimed lives before and fully intended to claim more. Gray Owl stood at the base with the rest of the council, Nasha included, and behind them, the entire gathered tribe, close to 200 souls now, including families who'd traveled in overnight once word of the ceremony spread. This is the final trial we will require, Gray Owl said, and something in his tone made Magnolia go still. The elders have conferred. 2 trials remain in the box, yellow and blue, but the council believes what we have already witnessed speaks loud enough. The cliff will decide the matter, one way or another. Tonight, relief and terror arrived together, the way they always seem to, on this impossible morning. 1 trial standing between her and either belonging or nothing at all. She looked up at the rock face, searching for any handhold, any crack, anything that might make the climb seem survivable, rather than simply theoretical. She found nothing that gave her comfort. She climbed anyway. The first 30 feet came almost easy. Muscle memory from a lifetime of farm work, translating into fingers that knew instinctively, hey, where weight belonged and where it didn't. Magnolia found handholds where none seemed to exist, pressed her enormous frame flat against sun-warmed rock, and climbed with a steadiness that surprised even her. Below, she could hear the tribe's collective breath held in something close to unison. The particular silence of a crowd that has decided without discussing it that even a whisper might be the thing that shakes a climber loose. She didn't look down. Topar's advice from 2 nights before came back to her unbidden, and she found herself repeating fragments of it under her breath, with each new reach, each new foothold, a rhythm to climb by when her own thoughts threatened to outpace her hands, until the rock changed. Smoother here. Fewer cracks. The kind of surface that offered nothing but the barest suggestion of purchase, and Magnolia felt her confidence crack, right along with the terrain, her fingers scrabbling for holds that kept crumbling away under even the gentlest pressure. She was 60 feet up, high enough that a fall meant death, no question, no debate. And that's when the memory hit her. Unbidden, unwelcome, complete. Delphine, 12 years old, laughing on the bluff behind their folks' old place, saying somebody had to be brave first, so the other one didn't have to be scared alone. Delphine's foot slipping, the scream, the scramble to catch her, too late, too slow, watching her sister tumble the last 8 feet and land hard enough to break an arm, hard enough to leave both of them shaking for a week afterward. Delphine, 10 years later, dying in a bed 3 counties away while Magnolia worked cattle and told herself she'd get home in time. She never got home in time. Her hand slipped. Not far, not fatal, but enough that her whole body swung sideways against the rock face, enough that a strangled cry tore loose from her throat before she could stop it. Enough that 60 feet below, the entire gathered tribe gasped as one. Magnolia hung there, one hand barely gripping a crack too shallow to trust, feet scrabbling for purchase that wasn't there, and felt the particular, paralyzing terror of a body that had simply stopped believing it could keep going. I can't. Because that was the thought that arrived first, ugly and complete, drowning out every other consideration. Not fear of falling, fear of failing, of proving every single person who'd ever called her a monster right, in the worst possible way, with nobody left afterward who would even remember her as anything else. Magnolia. The voice cut through the panic like a blade. She looked down. Nasha stood at the base of the cliff, both hands cupped around her mouth, voice raw with something Magnolia had never once heard from her before. Look at me! Not down, at me. Magnolia forced her eyes to Nasha's face, 60 feet below, small and fierce, and shouting with an urgency that had nothing left of contempt in it at all. You did not come this far to fall for a ghost, Nasha shouted. Whatever you are seeing up there, it is not real. The rock is real. Your hands are real. Find the next one. I can't. You can. I have watched you cross a river that should have drowned you. I have watched you walk out of a cave bleeding and still standing. You do not get to stop now, because of something that is not even here. Something in Magnolia's chest cracked open at the sheer, unexpected force of it. Nasha, of all people, the one voice in this entire tribe that had spent 2 days since she'd fail, now the one voice refusing to let her. Find the next hold, Nasha shouted again. I did not lose my husband, so I could watch another person fall today, because they stopped believing their own hands. Move! Magnolia's fingers found a crack she hadn't seen before, 3 inches to the right, solid where the last one had crumbled. She shifted her weight, tested it. It held. That's it. Nasha's voice again, hoarse now, but still carrying clear up the rock face. Now the next one handhold at a time. One breath at a time. Magnolia climbed the remaining 140 feet with her sister's ghost, finally mercifully, going quiet in her chest, replaced instead by the sound of a grieving woman's voice, refusing to let her fall. She crested the summit as the sun reached its highest point, collapsed onto solid ground on hands and knees, and for a long moment simply breathed, chest heaving, palms torn raw, the whole world spinning slightly at the edges from exhaustion and terror, and something that might impossibly have been triumph. Below, she could hear the sound rising up from the canyon floor. Not silence this time, singing. Not the morning song from 2 days before. Something different, faster, fierce with celebration, rising from 200 throats at once. Magnolia laughed. A real laugh. Startled out of her by relief so complete it nearly undid her all over again, and pressed her torn palm flat against her chest, as if she could physically hold her own heart together through sheer pressure alone. She'd done it. She was alive. The climb down took longer than the climb up, careful and slow on legs gone weak with adrenaline crash. Helona reached her first, once her boots touched solid canyon floor, wrapping both arms around her without any of the ceremony's usual careful distance. "You did it," Helona said, voice thick. "You actually did it. Told you I would. You didn't sound so sure a minute ago. I heard you. Up there. You sounded terrified." Magnolia managed something close to a laugh. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Terrified doesn't mean giving up, though. It just means the thing mattered enough to be worth the fear." Behind Helona, Nasha stood apart from the rest of the crowd, arms wrapped around herself now instead of folded in judgment. And when Magnolia caught her eye, something passed between them that needed no translation at all. Magnolia rose, crossed the distance between them. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. For up there, Nasha's jaw worked a moment before she found words. "I did not do it for you," she said, though the words came without their usual edge. "I did it because I could not watch another person fall from that cliff. Not after," she stopped. Started again. "Not after everything else I have already lost to falling." "I understand, do you?" Nasha studied her a long moment. "My husband did not fall from a cliff. He fell to a man's cruelty that no law in this territory ever answered for. I have carried that fall inside me for 11 years. Carried it so long. I forgot grief and judgment were not the same thing. I looked at you 2 mornings ago and saw only his size, only the shape of what took him from me. And now," Nasha's eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady. "Now I see a woman who crossed a river, fought a lion in the dark, and climbed a cliff that has broken better warriors than either of us. Not for glory, not for gain, but because she gave her word to a dying stranger and refused to let that word mean nothing." She paused. "I was wrong to judge you by his shape. I am sorry it took 2 days of near death for me to learn that." "You don't owe me an apology, I do," Nasha said firmly. "Grief does not excuse cruelty forever. Only for a time. My time has run out," she extended a hand. An unusual gesture Magnolia would later learn. Between an elder and someone still undergoing judgment, and Magnolia took it. Enormous palm swallowing Nasha's smaller one entirely. And something in that simple contact felt heavier than the entire cliff face she'd just survived. Gray Owl called the council together at the base of the cliff as the afternoon sun began its slow slide toward evening, and the gathered tribe drew close, sensing, correctly, that whatever came next would settle the question this whole strange ceremony had been built to answer. He spoke at length, voice carrying clear across the assembled crowd, and Helona translated as she went, her own voice thick with emotion she no longer bothered hiding. 3 trials. The river, that does not forgive weakness. The den, that does not forgive hesitation. The cliff, that does not forgive fear, only the refusal to be ruled by it. You have faced all 3, alone, exactly as you offered, when you could have sent another in your place, or accepted a willing hand to share the burden." Gray Owl paused, glancing toward Nasha, who gave the smallest nod. "The council is unanimous," Helona continued. It was breaking now. "All 5 elders. The 2 trials remaining in the box will not be asked of you. What we have witnessed already answers the only question that ever truly mattered, which is," Magnolia managed, voice raw. Gray Owl answered this himself, in careful, deliberate English, loud enough for the whole gathered crowd to hear. "Whether your heart, when tested past what any person should reasonably survive, remains the same heart that gave away a horse to save a stranger's life, it does. We have seen it." 3 times over, he raised one hand. Behind him, all 70 warriors mirrored the gesture instantly, feathers lifted high overhead, And this time the sound that rose from the gathered crowd wasn't a war cry, wasn't a mourning song. It was pure, unrestrained celebration. They dismounted in waves, same as the first morning, except this time each warrior who approached knelt directly at Magnolia's feet, placing their white feather on the ground before her, with a reverence she still, even now, struggled to feel she'd earned. Gifts followed, woven blankets, carved knives, a pouch of dried meat and herbs from a woman who pressed it into her hands without a word, simply nodding once before stepping back into the crowd, and finally led forward by two young riders, her mare, Daisy, adorned now in a new ceremonial covering, decorated with symbols. Magnolia still couldn't read but understood, without needing translation, represented something enormous. Gray Owl approached last, both hands settling on Magnolia's shoulders. Had to reach up to do it, same as that very first morning, and this time the gesture landed entirely different against her skin. "You arrived among us a stranger carrying a gift," he said, Halona's translation keeping pace, though her voice kept catching on the words. "You leave among us a sister, having given far more than any gift required. 70 families now stand between you and any harm this territory might ever try to bring you. This has been granted to only 3 outsiders in the history of our people. Never before to one who was not already born among us." "I don't know what to say," Magnolia admitted, voice thick. "Say nothing," Gray Owl replied, something almost like warmth in his weathered face now. "Your actions have already spoken enough for 3 lifetimes." Magnolia stood at the edge of the celebration a long while, watching children weave between dancing adults, watching fires being built up against the coming evening, watching the particular joy of a community that had just witnessed something it would tell stories about for generations. She had spent so many years standing at the edge of gatherings like this one, watching other people's belonging from a careful distance, that it took her a long moment to understand. The gathering tonight was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually about her, and actually including her rather than simply tolerating her presence at its margins. That night, they camped at the edge of the Apache village rather than riding the 18 miles home in the dark. And Magnolia sat by a fire that wasn't her own, surrounded by people who 2 days ago would have been strangers, feeling something in her chest she hadn't felt in longer than she cared to admit. Halona found her there, settling down beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who'd stopped counting Magnolia as an outsider sometime around. The moment she'd hauled herself out of that river with a bleeding hand and a refusal to quit. "You're staring at the fire like it owes you money," Halona observed. "Just thinking?" "About," Magnolia considered the question a long moment. "My sister," she admitted finally. "She died thinking I wasn't there when she needed me most. I've carried that a long time, longer than I probably should have. And tonight? Tonight I climbed a cliff with her ghost trying to pull me down, and a woman who hated me 2 days ago screamed me back to my senses instead." Magnolia shook her head slowly. "I don't know what to do with a day like that. Don't know where to put it." Halona was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "Perhaps," she said finally, "you do not put it anywhere. Perhaps you simply let it sit beside the grief, instead of underneath it. Both things can be true. You failed your sister once long ago, in a moment you could not control, and you have now proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly who you are when it matters most. That's a generous way to look at it." "I have had a difficult 2 days," Halona said, and something almost like humor touched her voice, for the first time since Magnolia had met her. "I am allowed a little generosity by the end of it," Magnolia laughed. Quiet, tired, real, and for a while the two of them simply sat together, in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low against a sky thick with stars. Neither of them felt any particular urge to name. They rode home 3 days later. Once Halona's shoulder had healed enough to spare her the worry of infection. Once the last of the celebration had settled into something closer to ordinary life continuing around them. They stopped in Willow Bend first, need for supplies outweighing any desire to avoid the town's stairs a little longer, and Magnolia found herself bracing out of old habit as they rode down the familiar dusty street. The The bracing turned out to be unnecessary, because riding beside her, close enough that nobody in town could mistake the arrangement for coincidence, rode two Apache warriors, an honor guard, Tobar had called it, insisted upon by the council, a visible reminder to anyone who might think twice about how they treated a woman now bound by sacred law, to 70 families willing to defend her. The street went quiet as they passed. Not the old kind of quiet, though, not the flinching, whispering silence Magnolia had grown so used to over the years. This silence carried something closer to shock, recalculation, the particular stillness of people forced to reconsider, all at once, everything they thought they'd understood about a woman they'd spent years dismissing. Old Man Hobbs stepped out of the mercantile as they passed, wiping his hands on his apron, staring frankly at the two warriors flanking Magnolia's horse. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," he said, though his eyes kept darting toward her companions, clearly working hard to keep his voice steady. "Wasn't sure I'd be coming back at all. A few days ago," Magnolia admitted. "Heard some talk." Hobbs glanced at the warriors again, then back at her, something almost like respect creeping into his weathered face. "Didn't rightly believe, most of it. Believe what you like. I've got flour to buy." She caught sight of the Prescott boys near the church steps as she dismounted, the same two who'd mocked her only days before. They stared now with an expression that had nothing left of mockery in it. Something closer to awe, mixed with the particular embarrassment of children realizing, all at once, that the person they'd cruelly underestimated had turned out to be something far larger than their small jokes had ever accounted for. Neither boy said a word as she passed. Neither needed to. Their father, the banker, stepped out onto the boardwalk a moment later, drawn by whatever commotion two Apache warriors riding through Willow Bend had caused among his sons. He studied the scene a long moment, Magnolia, the warriors, the particular new quiet that had settled over his own boys, and then, to Magnolia's genuine surprise, removed his hat, a small gesture, the kind a man might offer any ordinary neighbor passing by on any ordinary day. She hadn't realized until that moment exactly how much she'd been starving for exactly that kind of ordinary treatment. All these years, the ranch looked exactly the same, sitting quiet against the dry wash, small house, smaller barn, waiting patiently for its owner to return. And yet everything about approaching it felt different now, Magnolia realized, riding Daisy at an easy pace beneath a sky gone gold with evening. Because 2 days ago, this land had stood alone against the world. One giant woman, carving out whatever small life the rest of the territory would grudgingly allow her. Now, riding up the last rise toward home, Magnolia could see it clear enough to ache with the seeing. 70 families stood between her and anyone who might ever again call her a monster to her face. A girl who'd offered to walk back into fire on her behalf. A woman who'd once hated the very shape of her, now willing to scream her name up the side of a cliff rather than let her fall. She reined Daisy to a stop at the top of the rise, looking down at the small ranch house that had once felt like the whole entire world and now felt instead like the beginning of something far larger than she had ever dared imagine. "Home," she said quietly, to no one but the horse and the wide gold evening. But the word meant something different now than it had 3 days before. Bigger, fuller. Stretching out past the borders of one small ranch to include a village hidden in a canyon fold, a river that had nearly taken her, a cliff face that had asked her to face her sister's ghost and choose. In the end, to keep climbing anyway, she'd spent her whole life being the largest thing in every room she ever entered, and feeling, despite that size, impossibly small and impossibly alone. There would be difficult days still ahead, she knew. Willow Bend would not change its whole character overnight, and some townsfolk would go on whispering behind cupped hands, no matter how many Apache warriors rode at her side. But something essential had shifted regardless. Some old weight finally set down after carried along hooked she'd nearly forgotten it could be put anywhere at all. She thought of Delphine, briefly, and found the thought arrived without its usual sharp edge, just a quiet ache, familiar, now, sitting beside the rest of her, the way Helona had said it might, rather than crushing everything beneath it. For the first time she could remember, riding down toward home beneath an empty sky, with 70 families now bound to her by a law older than the territory itself, Magnolia Thorne finally felt like she fit somewhere. Not despite her size, not because of it either, simply because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, somebody had finally looked past the shape of her entirely and seen, underneath it, exactly who she'd always actually been. The horizon stretched wide and gold in the fading light, mountains rising distant and patient in every direction, and Magnolia Thorne rode home alone, truly home, for the first time in her whole strange, oversized life, no longer wondering whether she belonged, but simply finally certain that she did.